Good morning. I'm Brenda Talent, the CEO of the Show Me Institute. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the case for Missouri's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. As an independent research and education organization, the Show Me Institute focuses on Missouri fiscal and economic policies from a free market lens. We want Missouri to be a state that leads the nation in wealth, quality education, and a flourishing civil society. Much needs to be done to get us there, and to protect the rights of taxpayers, the time is right to put in real guardrails to ensure Missouri does not simply continue to grow our state government as it has been for the last several years. We need accountability to taxpayers, and how we do that is what's going to be discussed today. Let me get some housekeeping out of the way. Zach Lawhorn, the communications director of Show Me Opportunity, will be our moderator. If you'd like to ask a question, look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you can click on the Q&A button where you can type your question. Zach will identify when we have a question and read the question submitted. You can submit your questions at any time. And with that, I would really like to introduce our two experts. They're the ones who've developed this Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which I think you're going to find quite intriguing. Elias Tsapelas is our Director of State Budget and Fiscal Policy. He earned his Master's of Arts in Economics from the University of Missouri in 2016. Before joining the Show Me Institute, he worked for the state of Missouri's Department of Economic Development and Office of Administration, Division of Budget and Planning. Aaron Hedlund is the Show Me Institute's chief economist. He's an associate professor with tenure at the Mitch Daniels School of Business at Purdue University, as well as a research fellow at the Federal Reserve here in St. Louis. From 2020 to 2021, Aaron was the chief domestic economist and senior advisor at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he received his bachelor's in economics and mathematics from Duke University. And with that, I'll turn the program over to Zach.
Thank you, Brenda. All right, Elias, I'm going to start with you. So today we're going to be talking about the Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It is a tax and expenditure limit, but Missouri already has one of those in place, and you wrote a primer recently about it. It's called the Hancock Amendment. So I thought a good place to start would be you telling the listeners a little bit about what the Hancock Amendment is and why you and Aaron think it currently is falling a little bit short.
Perfect. Well, the Hancock Amendment is a tax and expenditure limit that Missouri voters approved in 1980. So Missouri voters have long understood that unchecked government growth is bad for the state of Missouri. And that's something that we've really seen here in the last few years. So the key piece of the Hancock Amendment when voters first approved it over 40 years ago was essentially a revenue limit and refund provision. And so what that was saying was if Missouri's government grew faster than Missourians' paychecks, that money would be going back to them in a form of refund. In addition to that, it also had some pieces with basically controlling local government tax collections. And so many Missourians will have experienced these. They're called property tax rollbacks. And the idea with that was to essentially say, well, if your property values increase, that shouldn't give government license to grow. That money should be going back to taxpayers, unless, of course, they otherwise approved an increase in tax rates. And then finally, with this, essentially with the tax limits here, so you had the revenue limit on the state and on local governments. You also had a piece which was called an unfunded a ban on unfunded mandates, which essentially said that if you're going to limit state government, you need to be sure that with those limitations that they're not pushing or shirking those responsibilities and putting them onto local governments, because you're also saying that they can't increase their burden on voters without taxes. And then what happened after 1980 was that government was growing. People weren't really getting refunds. And so in 1996, voters approved an amendment to the Hancock Amendment, which instituted what's called a tax cap. And that tax cap essentially said, well, Missouri's legislature can't raise taxes without voters approving them. And while that might seem like the original amendment covered that, it really only covered it for local governments, and the piece on the revenue ceiling didn't really apply to the state. And so for over 20 years, we really thought that was working. But what I'll go to shortly here, I guess, is essentially how these different key pieces over time we found out don't work at all, or they've sort of grown out of date, so they don't work anymore.
And so when you say they don't work at all or they've grown obsolete, what do you mean? What are some of the ways that the current Hancock Amendment can be avoided or can be manipulated or just falls down on the job?
Well, over 40 years, I think our elected officials and such have sort of found ways around the amendment, found ways to grow the government. Over the last 5 years, Missouri's budget has nearly doubled, and part of that is because the Hancock Amendment isn't really working. So in terms of the first piece, this is a constitutional amendment, so this language isn't really something that changed. So there's this revenue limit. Well, when that went into the Constitution, it had the dates that it was tied to the personal income of Missourians and the state's revenues in 1980, 1979. So, Missouri looks a lot different 43 years later than it did then. So those are just simple numbers that have went out of date. But there are also other problems that have sort of popped up. And so what the amendment also did to try to limit these revenues, it had to define them. It had to say, well, what money is the state bringing in that we should count towards this? And that's actually a little more difficult than some people might think. Well, they created this term called total state revenues. And over the years, different types of revenue have been carved out of that definition. So it applies to less of the budget, but also the state elected officials have found out that tax credits, which are things that the state has typically given for economic development purposes, other things like that, where it essentially gives taxpayers in Missouri basically this credit, meaning they don't have to pay these taxes. Well, that is a way to go around the revenue limit. And so after Missourians received a few refunds in the late 90s as a part of this revenue limit, they haven't received anything in over 25 years now. And without this piece getting fixed, getting updated, getting the definitions fixed, they won't receive them again. And so going to the next piece is, well, so the tax cap, where the 1996 piece, what happened there, where it was saying, well, the legislature can't raise taxes without voters approving him, adding to an old constitutional amendment, they essentially introduced new text problems. Essentially, the new definitions they use don't really work with the old ones, and they introduce a little loophole that essentially said that if a tax increase was implemented over several years, there was not essentially a way for the state to really go back and say, well, actually, that did violate this piece. So what we found over the years is that basically the revenue limit, the refund piece, the formula for that doesn't work. The refunds aren't going to be coming back. And the tax cap, or the ban on the state raising taxes, isn't working. And then over the last few years, when it comes to the property tax, so at the local level, the first two are state-based issues with the Hancock Amendment. Over the last few years, we found with the property tax pieces at the local level that the property tax, people pay property tax on things that aren't just, that isn't just their home, even though home prices have went up a lot, and different Missourians have, in different parts of the state, have dealt with their local government not wanting to roll back their rates, even though that is what the Constitution requires. What they found when the value of their car went up was that actually, you're, in addition to paying the property tax on your house, you're paying it on your car and your personal property. And strictly, the Hancock Amendment doesn't have to apply to those. And so only, I think, one county in Missouri rolled back personal property tax rates. And in addition, the Hancock Amendment doesn't apply to commercial property. So it really only applies to one type of property. And over the last few years, a lot of Missourians have been hit with increased property assessments. And without those rollbacks, you've essentially seen a large influx of revenues to local governments that essentially function as tax increases that Missouri voters never approved.
All right, so Aaron, I'm going to bring you in here. So Elias has just laid out the current state in Missouri. So this webinar is called The Case for Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and I'm just going to turn it over to you for a few minutes and let you do that. So sell us on it. What's the case for Tabor?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me in here and everyone for joining this conversation. So the case for the current constitutional limits haven't worked is not a theoretical case, right? We've seen from 2019 to 2023, just the state-controlled part of spending has gone up by 40%. Inflation has been half that. I mean, for as big as inflation has been, state spending has grown at twice that rate. And the population has been very flat. GDP growth, gross domestic product, has also grown much slower than the state government. So whatever the theory was behind the Hancock Amendment, it has not worked. And practically speaking, my family and I, we've lived in Missouri for a decade. We've never received a Hancock refund despite the 40% increase in state government. So what we have isn't working. What can we do about it? And so what the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is fundamentally, it is a speed limit on government. It says to state government, you cannot grow faster, whether measured by revenues or spending. You cannot grow faster than population growth plus inflation. That's the speed limit. Now, why that particular speed limit? Why population growth plus inflation? Because what that does is it says that total per person spending, once you adjust for inflation, should be held constant unless voters approve going above that. Right. So basically what it allows the state to do is to continue to provide the current total level of services. But if people in the state legislature want to increase the total amount of state services that are provided, they need to go to voters for approval. Right. So this is not a restriction on how the state prioritizes. And in fact, I would say the 40% increase in spending over the past several years is an indication that the state has not been prioritizing. Revenues flow in, they just find a way to spend it all. And what we're saying is, no, instead of the legislature automatically spending all the money that comes in, it should be returning that money to taxpayers where it belongs, unless those taxpayers give explicit approval to spend it. The other key thing here is enforcement. So we've got a speed limit that limits the growth of government, and the enforcement is much, much stronger, because under our current Hancock Amendment, it really comes down to, for example, the legislature can pass small tax hikes as long as they're under some threshold. But as Elias pointed out, there's a major loophole there, whereas they could actually pass large tax hikes as long as it's spread over multiple years. But even so, even if they do pass a small tax hike, that's based on the estimate, the fiscal estimate. Right? So if they pass a small one, but then it ends up bringing in a lot more revenue than we thought, there's no accountability there. There's no way to claw back that money. Whereas what the Taxpayer Bill of Rights says is if revenue, actual revenue, regardless of estimates or forecasts or anything, comes in relative to last year above the speed limit, that money automatically gets sent back to taxpayers in the form of tax cuts, again, unless they vote to authorize that to be spent. So it's a real speed limit on government, a real limit enforced by automatic tax cuts where accountability goes back to taxpayers, unlike the current status quo.
So I do just want to drill down on one thing. So you said that the revenues come in higher than they did last year over the speed limit, and that money goes back to taxpayers, you said, through tax cuts. Other states, Colorado, I think, actually sometimes sends the money back to Missouri, to people in the state. Is that something that would also be included in the Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights, sending the money directly back to taxpayers?
So if you're talking about rebate checks, I mean, either way, what we're talking about is if money comes in above the speed limit, taxpayers are going to get a check, right? They're going to get money back. And by default, that would also translate to a reduced income tax rate or even sales tax rate the following year. Now, we do allow some flexibility on that point, which is if state lawmakers believe based on, well, I'll get after this. Basically, if we think it's a blip, right? Let's say revenues come in high, and it's just like a one-time thing, then taxpayers are for sure going to get money back. But there would be an option to kind of forestall the rate decrease. But if that happens multiple years in a row, then for sure the rate decrease would kick in. Either way, lawmakers would not have the ability to spend it unless voters explicitly authorized it.
Elias, one of the things that you've written about over the last few years is that Missouri is constantly rated one of the states that is the least prepared for an economic downturn, for a recession. For the last several years, we've been hearing a lot about a coming recession. How does the Taxpayer Bill of Rights address those concerns?
Well, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights does something that I've written about at the Show Me Institute for several years here, which is that Missouri's current rainy day fund doesn't work, and it creates something that will work and will essentially improve Missouri's rankings as it relates to the rainy day fund. So one of the concerns that people typically have with these tax and expenditure limits, like the Hancock Amendment or Taxpayer Bill of Rights, is what's going to happen when there is a downturn. We spend a lot of time talking about what happens when revenues are in excess. Well, what happens when revenues are down, and what that can mean for other parts of government? Well, one of the things that that we're doing here with our Taxpayer Bill of Rights is we are creating a completely separate, we're calling it a recession preparedness fund, that will have enough money in it. The current rainy day fund in Missouri doesn't have enough money to respond to a recession. So it would have enough revenue. It would have 15% of the previous year's total revenues collected, which is roughly what previous recessions have resulted in terms of a shortfall. And then it would have, it has provisions in there that essentially allow for the state to spend it when there is a need, where the current rainy day fund doesn't really allow for budget stabilization use of the fund. It's essentially used for cash flow. So this fund would be used for when there is a shortfall to help the state keep the level of services the same. And it would then allow, it has provisions in there to basically refill the fund when times are better. And it also is a little bit more lenient in how the state would be paying back the fund, because that's also another major problem with the current rainy day fund. So the current rainy day fund essentially is, we're getting kind of the worst of all worlds here. It's too small, it's too hard to access, and it's too hard to pay back. So since Missouri's had it over 25 years now, it has never been used for budget stabilization. So you see what we've seen over the last 5 years, where the state becomes increasingly reliant on the federal government. Well, we would have with our recession preparedness fund, you'd have Missouri less reliant on the federal government, more prepared to take on recessions or economic downturns, but also maintaining all of the revenues there so that there isn't anything to worry about with the adoption of a stronger Taxpayer Bill of Rights or tax and expenditure limit.
So Aaron, I mentioned Colorado. There's a few other states that have Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Missouri, over the last 5 years, the budget has nearly or more than doubled. We're at about $52 billion. In other states that have implemented a similar thing to the Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights, have we seen slower growth in spending?
Yeah, it's made a real impact. I mean, what we're suggesting, so I said right now, Colorado is kind of the gold standard for Taxpayer Bill of Rights, for tax and expenditure limits. We're actually looking at almost the platinum standard here, because even in Colorado, there's been some kind of Swiss cheese poked into it, in the sense that there are some ways that people have worked around it by creating separate revenue and spending streams. But I would say, by and large, it's been quite successful and popular in Colorado, because what you've seen many, many times in Colorado, people have gotten Tabor checks, Tabor refunds. And so this is no longer a theoretical thing where, they know there's something in the Constitution they've kind of heard of. They experience this. They actually get these refunds, which prevents the state from growing faster than it otherwise would. And as further evidence that it's worked in Colorado, more progressive types have really tried to erode it further. So the current governor and others put on a ballot initiative this past fall that would have greatly watered down the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And despite the fact that the political composition of Colorado has changed dramatically since the original passage of Tabor in the 90s, something like 60% of voters voted against watering down the Taxpayer Bill of Rights this past November. So these weren't just people who were kind of committed free market people who are regularly voting for those types of policies. These are a broader cross-section of Coloradans who realize it helps maintain their livelihood from getting pushed upon by government.
All right, I want to remind viewers that you can submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So Elias here, I want to make sure that we leave our viewers with something useful. Let's talk about process. So right now, Missouri does not have a taxpayer bill of rights. We think they should. What does that middle section look like? What are some of the ways that the state could adopt a taxpayer bill of rights?
Well, one of the ways to amend Missouri's constitution, because this would have to be a constitutional amendment, is for Missouri's legislature to take up the taxpayer bill of rights and pass it, and then that would send it to voters to approve. That is something that, you know, we just published our brief on this, I think last week. So this is something, you know, we're trying to, you know, communicate to more people. I do think that it is becoming more and more, you know, recognized across Missouri that the size of government is really growing. Things are kind of getting out of hand, and our financial future is definitely questioned. I mean, you know, there's a lot of concern of recession. There's concern about how big the government is, how much the federal government has been swaying decisions in the state. So I do think it is something that is on mind for a lot of people. And so ultimately, you know, if this is something that Missouri legislature or, you know, elected officials aren't interested in, this is something that, you know, Missourians can get to the ballot. Just in August at our election last week, there were initiatives there that were brought by people. It requires signatures from parts of the state. And I think there will be more in November. Missouri has a process for these things. I think we're one of the easiest states to amend the Constitution. So there are several routes, but I think the first thing is to get everyone on the same page that, you know, what we're doing is unsustainable and there is a path forward. We're kind of losing ground to our surrounding states, to some of our the more free market focused or, you know, lower tax states. We're kind of losing ground there. As Aaron, I think, mentioned earlier, our population growth is pretty stagnant. And so, you know, there's several routes to go, but I think the first thing is, you know, recognizing there's a problem and getting broad acceptance for that. And so I think we're just starting the steps on that.
Aaron, do you have any sense at how receptive policymakers in Missouri would be to something like a taxpayer bill of rights?
So at least from what I'm hearing, they recognize the problem. I mean, they recognize that the state has grown way too rapidly in terms of its spending. And they also recognize the threat, if you will, of states like Texas, Tennessee, Florida attracting away Missourians. And actually, if you look at the data, that's not just a threat, it's a reality. If you look at the number of people who relocate from Missouri to Tennessee, and you compare that to the number of people who relocate from Tennessee to Missouri, it's much more out-migration than in-migration. In other words, we are losing out to Tennessee big time. So I think the legislature recognizes the problem, and you have had some proposals out there about how to try to limit spending. And you know, now's the time to make the case. Now's the time to make the case that this is the solution that can tackle the spending problem in a way that's enduring, in a way that's popular, in a way that really advances the state. And I think it's not just a matter of the legislature. I think it's also a matter of, you know, leadership from the executive, whoever that may be in January. And then again, you know, it's also something that Missourians themselves can really push.
So Elias mentioned the pace of Missouri's budget growth. If Tabor had been implemented, let's just say pre-COVID, do you have any sense? I don't need an exact number, but do you have any sense of how, if it had been in place since 2019, how it would have impacted the explosion of the state budget?
Yeah. So first of all, I can give you an even, you know, modestly more dramatic example. If we had had this taxpayer bill of rights over the past decade, which remember includes an automatic tax cut enforcement mechanism, then we would see an income tax right now that would be in the mid-3s instead of where it currently is. So that's a pretty profound difference from where we currently are. And for example, the federal money that really got injected into the economy in 2021, which was seen by, unfortunately, too many policymakers as kind of a slush fund to spend on whatever, largely that would have had to be sent back to Missouri taxpayers, or those Missouri taxpayers would have had to approve the spending on those programs. And I, for one, have not seen any positive economic effects of the big spending spree over the past few years. So it really would have dramatically changed how we approach that.
Elias, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you would see a different trajectory on Missouri's budget. It would certainly be smaller than 52 billion. And I think one of the key pieces that a Taxpayer Bill of Rights would do is it would force Missouri's legislature and governor to make some hard decisions about Missouri's priorities, our spending priorities, because what we've seen over the last several years with all this, sort of easy money from the federal government, and in that same period, state tax revenues have also increased. Some as a result of inflation. And what we've seen is that there's been just enough money that the state has been able to say yes to many things. And it's been an easy time. They haven't had to make a lot of hard decisions. And that's kind of why we're in a difficult spot right now as the federal money is about to dry up. And so I think with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, you're going to have a legislature that's going to have to be looking a little more closely at, the federal government offers some money with some strings involved. Maybe they won't offer that money permanently. A perfect example of this would be currently what Missouri's dealing with the state subsidized childcare program, where the federal government infused hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up the state's program during COVID. Well, they said from the beginning that money was only going to be temporary. That was going to be taken back. And, now Missouri's really struggling with how do we keep going with this? And I think the legislature, because there's been enough money, is trying to, keep that going, even though that was basically a federal prerogative. Missourians haven't weighed in on if they want a much bigger, the state's government to have a much bigger role in the childcare space. But that's something that I think if there was a Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that's a tangible item that I think would have either been pushed to voters or the legislature would have had to make a tougher decision than what they previously were able to make.
So I think that's an interesting point, that when we think about reducing spending, it's current programs. Like you said, you're going to have to make some tough decisions, but it sounds like policymakers are going to have to be a lot more forward-looking and thinking that, all right, so maybe the feds are going to pick up the first 5 years of this program, but then I'm going to have to go make the case to voters, right, to keep the funding.
Yeah, and I really think I think that'd be a good thing for all of us, because I think a lot of times, I've written about in the past, this year's legislative session, the budget process was probably one of the most opaque, most confusing, probably frustrating budget processes that they got passed at the end of the constitutional deadline. I mean, really up against the wire, a lot of bad things put in there. I mean, the governor had to veto, upwards of $1 billion worth of stuff because a lot of hard decisions weren't made really. And so I think, making the legislature look forward, stop trying to, just get to May or whatever we're working on. And then it also, because of how the limit is structured. So as Aaron mentioned before, the revenue limit or the spending limit increases by the rate of population, the state's rate of population growth and inflation. Well, one of the ways, if the legislature or elected officials want to spend more money, one of the ways to do that is to do things that they think will increase population growth. And so, getting a more forward-looking Jefferson City and, getting focused on population growth. And, we've seen economic research in other states, lower income taxes is doing a lot in that. I think different, economic development policy, other things like that to make Missouri more attractive. I think this isn't just going to be a speed limit in terms of, just a number on a sheet of paper that the legislature has to check off every year. The hope is that this kind of changes the balance in Jefferson City, more engagement with voters, a more forward-looking elected officials, and, hopefully a, sounder fiscal policy going forward.
Aaron, I want to talk about the second half of that equation. Elias said the rate of population growth plus inflation. And unfortunately, over the last few years, we've had the opportunity to run an experiment in real time. So how does a bout of very high inflation, which we've just had, and then hopefully normalization coming back down on the other side, how does that impact the Tabor formula, or does it?
Yeah, so really the measure of inflation we would be looking at is the lesser of consumer price inflation and wage inflation. So basically what it means is that the government can't go faster than people's paychecks. I think that's a fundamental principle that we want to uphold, unless voters want to weigh in and go beyond that, right? And that's a key thing behind all this Taxpayer Bill of Rights proposal, is that voters are given a voice, right? That's really what this is about. It's about saying that the legislature cannot increase the overall burden of government unless voters give them the A-OK. And if voters don't give them the A-OK, then for the first time in a long time, lawmakers are going to have to actually prioritize and decide what works and what doesn't, instead of just what sounds good, let's spend money on everything.
You mentioned I think you called them alternative revenue sources in states like Colorado that have implemented Tabor. Do you mean calling things fees instead of taxes? What are some of the things that you are still concerned about in other states that have implemented Tabor, and stuff that you would really try to guard against as Missouri thinks about how to write their own Bill of Rights?
Right. So you're absolutely right that the guardrails are key. And so that's why we talk about revenues and not just taxes, because we don't want Jefferson City to go, oh, well, we're just going to reclassify something as a fee and get around it. That would still be under the umbrella of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. What I referenced in Colorado is, every so often, and it's pretty rare, but every so often a group will make some kind of case for, well, we need this new program that needs to be funded from a different stream of revenue, and that should not count towards the limit. And our point is, no, this is an all-inclusive umbrella, right? We're not saying that a specific budget item should only grow at a certain rate, or a specific line of revenue shouldn't grow at a certain rate. That is overly prescriptive. Well, the lawmakers are elected for a reason to prioritize. What we're really saying is that the overall total burden of state government, all inclusive, should not grow faster than inflation plus population growth unless voters authorize going beyond it.
Elias, can we talk about the property tax cap portion of this again a little bit? So a lot of people watching, maybe all the people watching, they pay property taxes. They know what that's like. What would the experience of your average Missourian be like with property tax, especially the last few years? Housing prices have increased quite a bit. Property taxes, we've seen those go up quite a bit. What would that look like if Tabor was implemented?
Well, I think you'd see more property tax rollbacks than what Missourians have been dealing with. I realize many Missourians probably, don't go and check, their bill whenever they get their property tax bill to see exactly what the rate is. They're just seeing the dollar amount. And for most people, that number has went up. But in a large part of Missouri over the last several years, the property taxes on the property tax rate on their homes has actually had to roll back a little bit because of how fast assessment increases have been. And so that piece, which many people, like, it has been very beneficial. I think we'd have a little bit better of that with a Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights, because we had some issues in different parts of the state with how to necessarily count the inflation, or, when did the town last vote on a tax increase? There were some issues there that I think some local governments kind of got around. So the increased price of your house, you're going to guaranteed get a property tax rollback. But the really big pieces here are to add that to roll into the rollbacks, personal property taxes. So over the last several years, I know most Missourians have dealt with increased car prices. Well, that's something that really wasn't, I really don't even think it was thought about whenever, this was brought up. Most of the time, car prices go down as they get older. So Missourians would have received as opposed to seeing a, large increase in their personal property tax bill, it would have stayed relatively level. So they would have gotten a rollback there. And another big piece that would make Missouri more desirable to, businesses and people in other states is that we would also include commercial property in the rollbacks, which, really, if you're not going to roll back the rates on commercial property like Missouri's not doing right now, you're essentially disincentivizing capital investment among businesses. And so really, you want to be doing whatever you can to get businesses to invest more in Missouri. You don't want to be punishing Missourians for the value of their cars going up, especially, when they don't sell it. And, so I think this is going to be a stronger rollback provision that is going to apply to more things. And it's going to have less room for game playing, because as Aaron was mentioning, there is a lot of game playing that's going on here with basically how the Hancock Amendment has been used over the last 30 years. Over one of the stories when I was working in Jefferson City that they told one of the first weeks that I was working at the Department of Economic Development was how so many of these programs came about in the late 90s whenever Missouri elected officials didn't want to give refunds. So the state was very close to the limit, the Hancock limit. And so what they did was they just, okay, well, instead of giving out, relatively smaller refunds, but still refunds nonetheless, instead of returning that money to taxpayers, they created these different economic development programs that essentially allowed for the state to collect less revenue to get below the limit, which essentially function as direct spending, but it's just money the state never receives. So there's a lot of game playing that's going on. And one of the overarching goals of this Taxpayer Bill of Rights is to kind of stop that altogether, just more accountability, and Missourians will know where their money's going and when they're going to get it back. And if they think they're supposed to get it back, they will get it back.
Aaron, best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago. Second best time is today, something to the. So is there something about the environment right now that makes it a not the best time, just a good time for Missouri to implement Taxpayer Bill of Rights? I mean, Elias mentioned the 90s. Clearly, this has been a topic of discussion for a couple decades now, and nothing's been done. Why do you think now is an opportune time?
Well, I think what we've seen is this dramatic increase in government in just a short amount of time. I mean, the same conversation could be had about a totally different topic, like namely school choice. And you had during COVID, there's this realization that maybe not everything happening in the schools was as great as people thought it was. And now there's been this much more momentum towards increasing school choice. I think same thing here. Maybe people didn't realize just how quickly government was growing even before COVID. But then when it really accelerated to kind of warp speed the way we've seen it, and people really felt it in their pocketbooks through the inflation, again, inflationary overspending, I think there's much stronger interest. I would also add to that there's been a lot more interstate movement in the past few years. People are really reassessing, do I want to live where I currently live, or do I want to move somewhere else? And I think we can play both defense and offense on that point. On the defensive point, we don't want to lose a bunch of people to Tennessee and Florida. There's been a massive migration of people from across the country towards Florida. We don't want to lose, so how can we keep those people here? And then for people who are in very anti-growth states, like places like our neighboring Illinois, would probably be the prime target, and they're looking around where to go, let's bring more of them to Missouri. So this is a really opportune time to make sure we have the most pro-growth environment that we can.
All right, my last question here before we wrap up, and I'm going to start with Elias, and then Aaron, I want to get your thoughts. So we just had a primary election last week in Missouri, so we've got some candidates running in the general now, so there will be new leadership all over in Jefferson City come January 2025. Elias, what is your message to leave them with about the Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights?
Well, I think right now is just a really pivotal time for the state of Missouri and our financial future. A new governor is going to have just a budget that is going to be, it's going to need to be trimmed. There's really no way around it. The federal money is going to be drying up, and there's just a lot of new blood in Jefferson City. We're at this time that there are recession concerns, so it's a very uncertain time. There's a lot of work to be done. And I think that with the Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights, you're going to get, as we mentioned before, some tougher decisions. And I think a new governor, a new legislature, so you're going to have new leadership working on the budget in the House and the governor's office. They're going to have to be going through the budget and looking through everything. And I think they're going to realize that it's kind of hard to cut stuff because we're not tracking a lot of things. We're not tracking performance very well. We don't have very good data, and they're going to be going into this kind of blind, and it's a perfect time to reassess. And I think going forward, these stricter rules so that we could avoid getting into the spot again. I think Missourians thought, I think the people that even wrote the Hancock Amendment thought in 1980 that they were sort of fending off what is happening right now. It just turned out that the amendment just wasn't good enough to last. It didn't have the right language to last 40 plus years. And so this is a perfect time to reassess things. And the Missouri Taxpayer Bill of Rights will provide rules, more accountability here to help now and in the future. It won't grow out of date as we've seen before. And I think that it's a perfect opportunity that I hope some elected officials will grasp onto.
And Aaron, before I get your response to that, I do want to fit in just one more viewer question. Do cities and counties in Missouri have rainy day funds?
Let's just say, so go ahead, Elias.
Well, I don't know every one. I know many of them don't. And that is one of the big concerns with Missouri's ranking as it relates to recession preparedness, is simply because local governments do not have much set aside. I think some governments are in better shape than others. But if you're going to have a situation where local governments don't have money set aside, it's even more dangerous if the state doesn't. And so having a functional rainy day fund at the state level is going to benefit local governments as well. But that's not to say that local governments shouldn't. Our Taxpayer Bill of Rights doesn't build anything explicitly for local governments, but hopefully with additional accountability, they'll be able to prepare for the future better as well.
And Aaron, what message do you want to leave the new leadership in Jefferson City with?
I just say let's not settle for mediocre. Missouri has tremendous potential, but we're not realizing it. So we have to look in the mirror and be serious. If we look at the past couple decades, Missouri has grown very slowly economically. It's been closer to the bottom of the pack than it has been to the top of the pack. And that's not because of some kind of unsurmountable problem. We can address these issues. We can take a different path. And there's no reason why we can't be regularly ranked in those top states that are attracting tons of people. And this is one major way to get there. But it's not just about imposing rules and limitations. This is about giving a voice to Missourians, making sure that they get to decide the total burden of government, and empowering them.
All right, Aaron and Elias, I want to thank you both. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Brenda.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. You can learn more about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights on our website, showmeinstitute.org. Read it in detail. Also, please visit our website in order to see our upcoming events, because we have a number coming up. Again, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.